tones of my voice. My name is Andrew Petersen and I'm the CEO of the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia. And welcome to this first webinar in 2020, where we routinely provide an update to our members and invited guests on the tracking progress of activity of the BCSD Australia over each quarter. And in this one, I thought it would be timely to get to give some sense of what people are seeing as the trends, issues, challenges, and potential opportunities coming into what's been called the decade of action rather than just the year of action. So today, we're being joined by an absolute star-studded cavalcade of individuals. Excuse me while I fix the slides. Thank you. Star-studded cavalcade of presenters, but I'll get to that briefly. As we always do with our webinars, we do acknowledge that the particular webinar production is occurring on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We expect their elders past, present and emerging. Today we're going to, as I said, have a cavalcade of speakers from the, I always get this wrong, Tina, is it the fourth state and you're the fifth state?
Oh, Andrew, after 11 years.
To give you their sense of what was, took you a while, Tina, to give you a sense of what they're seeing and what they're going to be recording and tracking as individual and corporate action on a variety of topics. But what we'll do is, because of time constraints from a few people, we will tap into each of the speakers during the course of the hour that we have available. And if you do have questions, then by all means, send me a note through the chat function, which you can do on your dashboard through the More drop-down box. And what I'll then do is open up your microphone and enable you to ask that question. Our speakers, if I'm not mistaken, we now have all our guests on the thing that we're doing today, because I've completely forgotten my script. And with that, we're going to be looking at what happened at the United Nations Conference on Climate Change. We'll then give you an update on the negotiations leading up to this year's what's been called the Biodiversity Paris Agreement under the Biodiversity Convention. We'll also give you an insight on what happened last week at Davos, and then also a quick snapshot on what BCSD Australia sees as some of the issues into 2020, and a fairly large announcement that we're making today for you exclusively. So, but without further ado, and conscious of handing over to Rachael Alembarkis from the Sustainability Report. And Rachael, you and I have been talking, in fact, during the first few weeks of 2020 around a number of topics and challenges and issues. And so why don't you kick off with your insights into what you see as the big trend issues, what you're tracking in the Sustainability Report, and how people on the call can find out more and engage more with what your media outlet is doing in relation to those issues. So over to you, Rachael.
Well, hi, Andrew. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address the membership of BCSD Australia. You're right. As we've been talking about, one of the big concerns on my mind is the taking advantage of the fierce urgency of now. The crisis that's been presented to Australia through the bushfire season has really put front and center that climate change isn't a far off future risk. It's a clear and present risk across any number of categories for investors. If you want to talk about damage to property and insurance, if you want to talk about loss of life, if you want to talk about impacts to public health. So one of the themes that I'm very much exploring this year is the way in which we start to integrate a better conversation about managing the clear and present risks of climate risk, and as well as the future risks and opportunities that are presented by our changing climate. And as well as an offshoot of that, the way in which we consider, calculate, and look at the production and destruction of natural capital as part of that, because it's very hard to find if you're doing analysis from as an investor or as a financial reporter. It's quite difficult to find calculations that adequately measure and analyze companies' impacts on the natural capital within their ecosystems. So that's going to be a very big investment focus or writing focus for me this year. Another issue, if you can put aside, which obviously we can't put aside our changing climate and its impact on our environment and our ecosystems, the other big issue I think in 2020 that is coming through very clearly is a new focus on human rights. The Modern Slavery Act, as we all know, came into effect as of last year, but we're going to start seeing the reporting from companies with more than $100 million in revenue this year in their reporting cycle as to their exposures to modern slavery and the supply chain. And one of the more interesting conversations going on at the moment is if companies are looking at modern slavery, what other human rights considerations should they be examining in their supply chains while they have this opportunity? So I've talked with Mons Carlson Sweeney, who I'm sure many in the membership know, as the head of ESG research at Ausbil Investment Managers, and he's very focused on human rights exposures as a risk or an opportunity in the investment portfolio. And what he's saying to companies when he's engaging with them is, if you're going to take the time to do a modern slavery-based assessment of your supply chain, take an incremental amount of time and resources and expand your remit, look further on human rights issues. And he's being very quite forthright about that, as are other investors. So I would imagine that companies in Australia, both on the listed side and on the unlisted side, are going to be facing more questions from engaged investors who want to know that their companies are managing risks and potentially adding value around sustainable development goals on the human rights. And then the other thing I wanted to bring to the table this morning is so investors are engaged with companies at a faster rate, at a deeper rate, and in a more profound rate, but they're increasingly talking about using not just the carrot of engagement, but the stick of directors' votes. So hot off the presses this morning, the CEO of State Street Global Advisors, which is the second largest investor globally, has just announced that they are looking at companies, including the ASX 100, and if they will look at the laggards based on their internal ESG scoring mechanisms, and companies that are in the bottom 10%, their directors will face votes against them at the next proxy season. So that's a very clear shot across the bow. If you add that in with Larry Fink's most recent letter from BlackRock, that investors are firming up their commitments. They're not just talking about motherhood statements and fuzziness about sustainable investing, but they'll be looking for clear action from companies and will be taking active owner steps otherwise. So I think that's going to be a very hot discussion point for 2020.
Okay, so not that much to talk about this year.
No, quiet, desultory motherhood statements.
I think this will come as a running theme through all three of you, and that is the stark difference between 2019 and 2020 around investor interest of business non-financial performance. And in that regard, what are you seeing as some of the signs that the investor community are looking for business to develop and share and transparently hand over? And I guess, as importantly, are you seeing business starting to build their response to that? So you talked about modern slavery and the broader human rights agenda, and obviously in Australia particularly a certain cohort of business has been quite active in relation to Indigenous engagement and the work of Reconciliation Australia and the development of RAPs for certain companies. But is that getting scaled? Is that getting bigger? Are you seeing signs that perhaps business players that haven't been on the landscape are now starting to put their head above the parapet and start indicating that they're going to respond to some of these challenges?
Based on the reporting that I've been doing, Andrew, I would say yes, albeit for some companies off of a they're the beginning of that, shall we say, at that journey on terms of sustainability reporting and transparency. Admittedly, for investors as well, and they're also along the quantum of deciding what's important to them and how that they can meaningfully. And I sort of take issue with this whole idea of non-financial indicators. If it impacts on the balance sheet, it's no longer a non-financial indicator, is it? And that's sort of the language that's beginning to change. That things like human rights, things like climate impacts are no longer non-financial when they're having a deleterious effect on the company balance sheet, or perversely, or conversely, on the other side, they're providing better opportunities to capture market and develop new products. In terms of concrete action, you're seeing along climate again, you're seeing more companies making commitments along the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which are the voluntary guidelines for calculating future risk of climate. You're seeing more companies committing to it, and you're actually beginning to see companies that are starting to disclose some of their scenario analysis. But you can expect to see more pressure from investors and even more pressure from NGOs. It's been quite clear in an article I did last week. Bryn O'Brien, who's the executive director of the ACCR, one of the I hate to use it, but one of the activist shareholding organizations has said that they're going to double down based off of the bushfire season. They're going to be even more specific in what they ask for companies, and they're going to put a lot of pressure on investors to use their clout in companies to press for more transparency, more disclosure, and more action. And dovetailing into that, again, State Street Global Advisors has come out and said that they expect to see SASB's guidelines being used more broadly to calculate environmental and social non-financial indicators and indicators of materiality. So you can expect to hear more from investors asking, what are you disclosing? How are you disclosing it? And is it something that's comparable and transparent to us?
Thank you for that. Look, thank you for your time.
I appreciate that.
You have to sign off. Has anybody got a call of Rachael, or anybody who wishes to ask a question through the chat function?
Well, if we're gathering any questions.
8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Nope, didn't have any. So you're off the hook, Rachael.
I am off. I appreciate the time. If BCSD Australia members would like to engage further on the topics I've been talking about, you can visit www.thesustainabilityreport.com.au. I'm very easy to contact as well from the website if anybody has further insights or questions to share with me. And I encourage everybody to subscribe to the newsletter. Thank you for the opportunity, Andrew.
Thanks, Rachael. And for those remaining on the call, we are recording this webinar, and we will send out those links to each of the media outlets that we're engaging with this morning. So let's move on to the other parts of the webinar. And just as an update for the BCSD members, our AGM occurred on the 28th of November, and we're delighted to welcome the re-election of Rosemary Bissett from the National Australia Bank to the board. Rosemary has now entered into her third and probably final period on the board, and so any members who are interested in the next couple of years thinking about coming onto the board, we most certainly welcome you considering that as a potentiality. We also sadly thanked and farewelled both Fadi Gihar, the CEO of Symbol, and David Singh from Regroup from the board, and therefore we have 1 or 2 available casual vacancies, which we hope to make some announcements about filling those vacancies in the not too distant future. So let's now move on to one of the topics. And as a reminder, both for the members and for those of you who don't potentially or don't actually engage in the WBCSD member community, on the screen we have an outline of the work program that the Business Council with its members undertakes throughout its engagement. And what I did was, in that, overlaid what we're talking about today. So the issues of COP25, the issues of the biodiversity framework, and also the outcomes of the Davos Forum, all correlate to and relate information, data, analytics and intelligence to a large part of the work program that we currently undertake. So the members themselves also then utilise this information in work groups where a member is part of either the climate and energy work group or any of the others. And in that regard, the ones that I wanted to highlight today were those of the outcomes of the COP that was held in Madrid in late November, early December. And this particularly was an interesting COP, not the least of which was it was never meant to be in Madrid. It was always planned for Santiago in Chile, but was literally moved in, I think, the space of under 1 month from the capital city of Chile because of civil unrest. And this is one of the underlying concerns of these international and multilateral agreement processes, that the disengagement between the general populace and those who are involved on a very intense and deliberative level of these negotiations is perhaps not tracking as well as it might, and that the community, the broader community, is not seeing the results of these particular negotiations yielding any outcomes that have a material benefit to them. And so with that, in particular, this COP, as well as APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Council, fora had to be moved, and in the case of APEC, it was actually postponed. But what did happen at the COP? Well, this was always intended to be what's called a technical COP, which is a COP that looks at agreeing to the detail of language, wording, and concepts within a structured arrangement. And the structured arrangement in this particular case is the Paris Agreement, which was entered into in 2015. So we've been spending now 4 years in the deliberation of the detail of what the Paris Agreement content will look like, in the expectation that this year, 2020, will be the year that the action by companies will start to, countries rather, will come into operation. And based on that, they will adhere to the terms of agreement, the language, the instructions, the guidance that's been agreed to by all those parties to the agreement. The problem with this particular COP was that there was so much expectation going into it that, in addition to the perhaps high level, the details of which were to be agreed, there was a sense that there might be some sort of high level ambition that would also come with it, and that ambition would be new targets, new commitments, and higher ambition under a 1.5 degree framework by countries. Now, that didn't occur with the singular exception of the European Union's announcement in relation to its net zero commitment. I think in the order of investment to the realisation of that. We didn't see China, we certainly didn't see the United States, we certainly did not see Australia step up, as it were, and make commitments that were over and above the so-called business as usual commitments that currently exist under their own national determined contributions that make up the aggregation of commitments under the Paris Agreement. So the aspiration, as it were, that was there didn't eventuate. In fact, it evaporated fairly quickly. There was a indication indicated earlier, disconnect between the global and those that were present at the negotiations. One of connection relevance for them, whereas those desperate to see outcomes were not succeeding. And then the other element to it was the momentum in relation to key elements viewed as being a success if it was to come out of this COP, was that of what's called the carbon pricing mechanism, or the market mechanism under Article 6. Now, for reasons that we won't go into in any detail, it didn't eventuate. It got a long way towards its finalisation, but as you would appreciate, with 196 countries and the need for unanimous consensus on all content, it was going to be a difficult but not impossible ask for that to occur. Now, it didn't happen for a variety of reasons, but the primary one that's been pointed to was the intransience of Brazil and to a certain extent Saudi Arabia. Some claim that Australia was also being, not belligerent, but certainly being difficult in some respects in relation to the language. That hasn't yet borne out in terms of what I'm hearing from others. But there was, particularly in the media in Australia, a view that Australia was playing a drag, was a drag on the negotiations, at least in that respect. So we go into, and for our part, we were involved at quite a significant level by having a 4-person delegation present at the COP. This is the 23rd year of the 25 COPs that we've actually had a presence at these negotiations. And it was great to see our colleagues from Energetics, from AgriProve and also from New Forests engaged during the negotiation process, also in business side events, and also in the WBCSD briefings that were occurring on a fairly regular basis with those WBCSD members that were also there. They were also part of, and in fact, I think in one case was on the panel of one of the business-led events that WBCSD held under the mantle of the Marrakesh Accord. So apart from just tracking what was going on, we were also quite engaged and involved in the business interventions in the negotiation process through the formal tracking under the who is the business NGO representative to the United States under the Marrakesh Accord. What's going to happen next? Well, and you'll hear about this at the end, we are launching a year of action which is going to aspire to contribute to Australia's national determined contribution. So you know that the policy setting is the policy setting, and there really, to my way of thinking, is no utility in continuing to call for leadership, to call for policy action. What we need is a groundswell of behaviour, activity, commitment, pledges and action, and for that matter, ambition by business, civil society, state government and academia to bring forward what is our decade of action under the National Determined Contribution. And the reason why we're doing this is because all NDCs are due, in fact, for stock take this year. Australia's indicated that it's not going to make any updates to it, and we felt that it was not appropriate given the changed circumstances over the last couple of years in relation to business action, certainly action by cities and now increasingly by state government, that there was a moment in time to actually say, well, no, here's a marked up version of what ambition under our National Determined Contribution will be. You'll hear more about that at the end. We're also going to be engaged with the CDP at the Australian report launch on the 31st of March. We will also be holding monthly webinars to back up and progress our work on the National Determined Contribution. The Fiona Wayne oration this year will focus on climate risk on the 28th of May. We are anticipating attending the Australia Pacific Climate Action Week and highlighting Australian business action in August. And then finally, in November, we will be leading probably quite a large delegation, we hope, to this year's COP, which is being held in Glasgow, led by the British government. So that is our activity on, and I'm just conscious that somebody's actually sent me a quick email. Thank you, Paul. I will come back to you very shortly about that. Before I move on to what's happening in the biodiversity world, we might ask Murray to come in now, and particularly as he is, so far as I'm concerned, considered the guru on Australian environmental policy and regulation tracking and insight and commentary. Murray, I've set you the task of giving us a sense of what you see are the big ticket trends this year, and then importantly what you at Footprint News are going to be tracking. So over to you.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Andrew. That's a bold and untrue claim, but nevertheless appreciated. I guess I would nominate 3 key trends that I think are going to emerge in 2020. Firstly, on climate change, I think this is going to be the year in which a lot of change occurs, in which the misguided, the mad and the bad start to really get pushed out of the way. And I think there's multiple reasons for that, but I think one of the biggest is that the federal government can see its capacity to use Kyoto carryover units slipping from its grasp. And that's got extraordinary ramifications for what it's got to achieve in the years ahead. So at the very least, what you can expect from the federal government is constructive disengagement, where it lets states and territories just roll up their sleeves and get on with the task. But I actually think that we're quite likely to see a lot more than that. And I'm prepared to go out on a limb, and I think we could even see the bones of a bipartisan deal emerging at some stage or towards the end of the year. The reason I say that is that this issue has just blown up, for politicians on both sides of the fence for so long. I think that the recognition that it needs to be resolved is widespread. The pressure for a solution is so strong. I think the likes of Craig Kelly, Facebooking in a corner, is not going to be able to resist that pressure for significant change. On the biodiversity front, as Andrew said, at the international level, the meeting of the signatories to the Convention on Biodiversity, that will be biodiversity's Paris moment, or hopefully will be biodiversity's Paris moment. Locally, we have the EPBC Act review. That will be very significant. I think it was always a mistake to see it as something that would simply target green tape, which some people had thought it might be under a coalition government. I think that was never going to be the case. And certainly after what we've experienced this summer with the bushfires, that there is no way that climate change won't be front and centre in that review. And there's no way that review won't examine why it is that the Act, in its current form, hasn't delivered the level of biodiversity protection that we need. The third thing that I'd mention on the domestic front is Victoria's new environment law, which comes into effect on the 1st of July. And that's a very significant piece of legislation because for the first time in Australia, it introduces an enforceable general environmental duty. Other environmental legislation has a sort of, reference to an environmental duty, but this will be an enforceable general environmental duty. And that legislation, I think, could well prove a role model for other states and territories. So that's my three.
Okay. Wow. Let's unpick those, and let's start with the Victorian one first. What's the genesis of the Act, and most importantly, the incorporation of that general environmental duty? And do you have any sense that it would have a cascading effect in other environmental protection reviews, including the EPBCA and/or in New South Wales and elsewhere?
I don't know about its relevance to the EPBC Act. I mean, the Victorian Act has its genesis in a review of the EPA that was done a couple of years ago. I think that it's quite likely to be, it will be very closely watched by other states and territories. They work together very closely. There's a group called Alert, which is made up of environmental officials, and they share a lot of information and so on with each other through that forum. Then there's a constant search for good regulatory practice. The concept of a general environmental duty comes straight from OHS legislation. This is its first transfer into environmental legislation. It's been very powerful in OHS legislation, and it's now in OHS legislation in all states and territories. So I think its rollout into other jurisdictions is highly likely.
Yeah, I like the connection with OHS. That certainly makes it a lot easier for business to understand what its implications could be and therefore how to respond to it. So, yeah, that'll be great, something to watch. Going to EPBCA, I get the feeling that you and I are becoming so old that we can remember when Peter Garrett suggested that there would be a inclusion of climate change as I forget what the terminology is now, a nominated action, I think it was, under the Act. If everything old is new again, do you get a sense that there's going to be, it's going to be a year of arguing that the Act should include something around climate change, or do you think that there's something more root and branch that's going to occur to the Act? Or, as you said, given what's been happening nationally over the last few months, is this just going to be a cursory tick and polish rather than trying to make any substantive changes to environmental protection laws?
I don't think there's any way that this will be just a tick and flick exercise. The issue of a greenhouse trigger in the Act, I think, is probably likely to prove irresistible, and I think it could well garner widespread support. Businesses have been seeing states and territories eager to jump into the fray because there's been no sort of substantive federal engagement. If there's an EPBC Act greenhouse trigger, that helps to bolster the case for saying, well, we don't need this disparate state and territory interventions, or we don't need them to the scale that we might otherwise have needed them, because there is this federal, this federal involvement through the EPBC Act. So I reckon personally that a greenhouse trigger is very likely. More broadly, I think, one of my favourite phrases when the first EPBC Act review was done, the then Minister Tony Burke, then Environment Minister, said that the EPBC Act had to do more than just drive an ambulance under the cliff so that when a threatened species came hurling off the edge, it was there ready and waiting. You need to have more ambition for your central law designed to protect biodiversity. So I think this will be a very comprehensive and considered review.
I love that metaphor, that's great. Thank you for that. And what we might do is just press on, and if there are any further commentary points that you or Tina wishes to make around the issues that I highlight, more than happy for you to interject. And Tina, when I've concluded the Davos portion, I'll come back to your good self. So Murray and I were talking about the, I guess the topic or the issue that has been the climate review, but 2020 really does come to its own, and the reason largely for that is because the commitments under the framework of actually comes up for conclusion and review this year. And in the case of Australia, obviously, given what's been happening over the last 8 to 10 weeks, the spotlight around what Australia's response to the post-2020 framework of the biodiversity obligations is going to be far greater than I suspect anyone in government, and particularly in the department, felt was going to be highlighted. So on the screen, I've got a quick what's been happening and what's going to happen next so far as BCSD is concerned. And for those of you who may not have been aware, the Australian government actually did engage in a substantial stakeholder engagement process during the last quarter of last year to get feedback on what Australian stakeholders wanted to see as the preconditions for the negotiations going into this, this particular conference. The BCSDA members actually had their own consultation process because as part of the Australian Business and Biodiversity Initiative, we were able to construct a closed door and quite frank and fearless conversation around what the Australian business community felt around the successes or otherwise of the present arrangements, and what possible commitments could be made by business into this post-2020 framework, particularly where there is a philosophical challenge at the moment in relation to what the role of the biodiversity COP is about, where historically it has been around protecting areas and creating exclusion zones where biodiversity and ecosystem services are retained in their pure or their native state, and that other areas are necessary, as not the least of which is in where there is invasive species, eradication, presence of pesticides and others that are starting to erode the very nature of these protected areas in any event, does call into question as to whether or not that thinking is the way to go forward. And for its part, business, whether you may accept this for the genuineness or not, has actually been quite interested in playing a role in mainstreaming biodiversity in a number of sectors. The question is how, and one of obviously the frameworks for thinking around that was the development of the environmental profit and loss accounts, and which is now morphed into the work of the IPBES, the Natural Capital Coalition, and the work of the framework under capital protocol. Unfortunately, there's been consensus to go forward. But for its part, BCSD joined what's called the Lisbon Declaration, which was 28 of the WBCSD global network partners coming together to indicate that we would champion business action on biodiversity by identifying what were the policy asks, but also working on commitments and pledges and various activities that would lead to and be incorporated into the policy thinking up into this year's COP. BCSD in November was named as the Australian partner for the newly created Business for Nature Coalition. This is a spin-off of substantive work of the WBCSD, the Natural Capital Coalition, and in partnership with the World Wildlife Forum. and we will be having a lot to say about that in the months to come. The one that really surprised me, though, was to see that the International Chamber of Commerce has nominated biodiversity as a key 2020 issue for business. Now, I take that as a signal that the leadership under the Executive General of John Denton, who is an Australian, has identified this as one of the social license to operate issues for the business community. And so I think you're going to see, certainly at an international level, if not a national level, the prosecution of a narrative around business action on biodiversity being quite strong. And again, ideally in collaboration with others, including WBCSD, WWF and IUCN. And most recently, as last week, the WBCSD held a fairly large session at Davos to develop an engagement plan to amplify the business voice to governments at the key events throughout 2020 in relation to nature and people. For our part, we will be hosting a monthly webinar series on Australian business action under biodiversity. We will be holding a summit on biodiversity in the lead up to the IUCN, I was going to say triennial, that's the wrong word, quadrennial conference. It's being held in June. And then as with the climate conference, we'll be taking a delegation to the United Nations Conference on Convention on Biological Diversity, which is being held in Kunming in China in October. In relation to Davos, and I love this picture because it was necessary for the conveners to find a podium stand for Greta Thunberg to stand on. In other words, they had not contemplated that Greta was not of a height that he was able to stand at the platform, which kind of says a lot about Davos, with good intent, but not necessarily thinking through the implications of others who are not necessarily in the billionaires' row, as it were. But for all its considerable faults and criticisms that Davos engenders, it still remains one of the go-to fora in the world is licensed to the course. Climate number one item, and commitment made several months earlier in relation tenor of and the need for urgent response by business to this climate risk and not waiting. And so this was made out in arguments through the PwC's CEO survey this year. The Edelman Trust Barometer once again indicated that there has been, to use the expression of Murray, a falling off of trust by the broader climate change and troubling trend that business itself is not taking the action that needs to take. And obviously from a consumer perspective, if you're talking to values-laden consumers, if they don't see that a company is taking its fair share of responsibility around climate change, then will it be willing to purchase? The work of WBCSD was quite significant, but the one I wanted to highlight was the launch of the Circular Transitions Indicator. They've been working on this for some considerable time, of which BCSD in Australia, through its Circular Economy Work Group, has actually contributed. And this indicator, along with one that was also launched by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation at Davos, will be the first signals, I think, of the work of business organisations to support business thinking around the re-estimation of the business model on product. So the assumption that all product comes at no consequence to climate, no consequence in relation to water use, the use of natural resources is something that both the MacArthur Foundation, the GRI, from a reporting framework, and also the WBCSD have been working quite hard in helping companies to start thinking through what is the analytical tool that's needed to better assess the impact of a product or technology and its impact upon the environment. What are we going to do as a result of Davos? Well, the BCSD members will receive their insights report on this next week, along with the WBCSD report, which will come out. We will be hosting a webinar with the WBCSD in March through the Circular Economy Work Group on what the implications of the transitions indicator could mean for companies in Australia. We'll also be hosting in May a webinar on the Future of Work program, which is going to be relaunched by the WBCSD in a few weeks' time. And then also incorporation of into we'll have a webinar June to bring forward to the number of companies in Australia. So that's not necessarily a good segue to cut out Greta. Tina is incredibly young, but is old in knowledge and I consider the DNA of Tina. As with the others, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the big trends in relation to the sectors and issues that you are looking at for 2020 and what you at the Fifth Estate is going to be looking.
Thanks, Andrew. Can you hear me properly? It's fading in and out a bit.
Yes, we had.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, I think for 2020, we're calling it the deadline decade. It certainly feels like that after Christmas, like the whole world has changed a bit. But I think there'll be a ramping up of the major trends that we saw in 2019. And there's 6 major trends that we can easily identify. But mostly the 2 big drivers, I think, are the change in consumer sentiment. Now, that's been rising for some time, but it's been given a huge fillip by, something as simple, really, as the War on Waste program that the ABC had. There's a broad consumer take-up of concern for plastics. Even the Prime Minister's mentioned that's a problem. It's a nice, safe space to tackle what's going on in the world of the environment. That you can also see the impact of that in retail shops, people starting to declare the provenance of their products, major companies such as David Jones saying that they're going to have a chain of custody declaration on everything. I don't know where that's got to at this stage, but the declaration is important. These people spend enormous amounts of money to research what's going on in consumer trends. We can see the shift in consumer trends also in the surveys of concern for climate, which has been rising steadily. The Lowy Institute, the Australia Institute, a whole range of people have been pointing that out, and Ipsos most recently, actually. So you see the evidence of that in retail. You're also seeing, so what that's doing is putting pressure on a whole lot of expressions in the consumer world, such as the retail, such as also superannuation funds and investment. So we're getting super funds saying they're being questioned about their investment choices. So going back to what Rachael was saying at the beginning, there's enormous pressure there. And they're moving. They're actually starting to respond. They're nervous about being questioned in public at their annual general meetings and also randomly by people calling them up. There's the big moves that we saw with BlackRock is immense. Also spoke to Tim Buckley after that, and he said that in his cohort, they've been putting enormous pressure on individuals rather than tackling whole boards, which he calls boring boards that are hard to shift in terms of sentiment. They've been picking on people who have the cult of personality attached to them, like Larry Fink, like Jamie Dimon, who heads the biggest bank in America. So he says if you can actually change those two people, one heading up the outfit that is the biggest fund manager in the world, and two, the biggest bank in the world, which is JP Morgan Chase, headed by this very well-known figure, Jamie Dimon, then it's game over, he says. So they're working personally on trying to shift it. He says, Larry Fink took a couple of years to shift seriously. Jamie Dimon will take about a month. So I don't know whether that's true or not, but we're watching, and it's good to hear about State Street. He's very confident. But these are people that know them personally, and they're having 3-hour meetings with them. They're actually pinging them on an individual basis. And the theory that we have at the Fifth Estate after many years of observing is that people individually all care about the environment. They all love nature, mostly. There's very few people who don't. But when they get into a boardroom, they make decisions that are sort of covered by this cult of boardroom cohesiveness, I suppose. But individually, you can actually, they probably go home and they're very, loving, caring people. So we've seen that pressure. So you've got the consumer pressure, you've got the corporate pressure manifesting in super funds, but also in the built environment. We specialise in the built environment, and we're getting comments from companies, major property companies are saying, what are the major trends? And they're saying, well, sustainability is, climate is. And we're getting that pressure from the big institutional investors. So you have companies in Australia that are maybe 50, 60% owned by international super funds, institutional investors, and they're not like Australians. They don't, they're not like Australians and Americans in terms of the politics that dominates our countries. They're into it with the ears pinned back. They want to show that they're sustainable and climate sensitive, etc. And they're saying to these companies, I would like to invest in your company, but I want to know how sustainable you are. I want to know if you're a member of GRESB, which is the global real estate, GRESB, Global Real Estate Benchmark for Sustainability, Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark. So they're saying, are you a member of that? And if not, why not? And if you're a member, what is your score? And they want to know that before they make a decision. So that's putting pressure on all the local property owners to get their act together with varying results. There's a lot of greenwash still going on. There's a lot of, and I think we're going to be focusing more on that this year, that some of the bigger companies that have got great profiles, they do very well on some aspects of their developments, and the others are pretty marginal. So why is that so? So we need to sort of start, asking the question, I suppose, in the same way that Tim Buckley and his friends are asking the questions on a very personal level of some of these big companies. So that's another big trend, I think, that will accelerate. And the dodgy builder developer kind of scandal that happened last year with Opal Tower, etc., that's really upset a lot of people. And I think the industry itself in building and construction is starting to get concerned. And David Chandler, who's a regular writer for us and been appointed the New South Wales Building Commissioner, he's looking at some kind of rating system that separates the good from the bad. He's saying good developers do very well. They are the same developers that are doing office building that don't have a problem. Our office buildings do not fall over. They do not have flammable claddings. And yet some of these same developers, when they go and do residential, there are problems. Now, we understand that it's much harder to do residential than it is office because they're so much more finicky. They've got a lot of plumbing to include, etc. So buildings are a big thing, and they're also focusing consumers of property on the problem of quality. And listening to you, Andrew, with all these fantastic initiatives that are going on worldwide, and they must be so hard because we're shifting, a massive ship here to change direction. It's just so good to hear. And also with Murray hearing about the legislation changing, etc. But it's just, we've got a lot of really good legislation already, I think. We certainly have really good legislation on building quality, but somehow it's not being policed. So we can have great penalties, for things, but no one's bothering to actually, not many people are bothering to pick up and say, how about delivering? So I think there's going to be pressure to deliver not just on good legislation, but on the outcomes and performance of companies. You know, we don't have enough policing, perhaps. I'm not really advocating a police state, but when it comes to quality and environmental outcomes, maybe we do need it. The other big pressure, so retail buildings investment and on government's policy, you know, at the moment we can see that the strongest movers are the state governments. They're doing amazing work, Victoria in particular. But New South Wales has also really started to shift lately. We're, you know, seeing Matt Keane taking on the federal government, or the federal government taking on Matt Keane, we should say. You know, doing amazing you know, trying to shift the perceptions of it as a state that cares. Rob Stokes has done a lot of work, and he's the minister in charge of, you know, that mega cluster of departments now that are very, very important to the future of the built environment and energy. So we know he is on the right side of history with his intentions, but now we've got the Premier and other people starting to speak up, and I think there'll be a shift there. Also, they're very competitive. They see Victoria doing well, and Queensland is, you know, problematic. It always has been, I think. It's got a state government's doing some good things. There's an election coming up for Brisbane City Council, and I was speaking to somebody about that just yesterday. And Brisbane City Council is massive. It takes up the whole of Brisbane, and it cares, you know, its area of powers is over the built environment and zoning and things like that, and it can deliver roads, but it can't deliver public transport. So you've got this huge disconnect, and what I hear from insiders is that the Brisbane City Council will not talk to the state government, will not have a discussion with them. It is extraordinary. So you've got transport decisions being made that are not fully integrated with land use. That's a problem. We have talked nationally again of building rail. The fast rail seems to be a bit of fairyland, but there is still rising talk again now in discussions with the big engineers that there's a good case for a fast rail of some sort from Melbourne, Canberra to Sydney. You know, the population is a problem. They're the major trends. I think the big councils as well are also doing fantastic work with resilience. They're part of the C40 group, which, you know, where mayors are talking to other mayors around the world, the biggest ones, and they're doing amazing work. They're the ones that can actually, they're on the ground, they've connected to the constituents, and there's great hope for them because they're the ones making decisions on planning rules and what your environmental outcomes are. And I'd just like to mention Perinotto. It's doing amazing work. It's brought in a particular planning control for the CBD that mandates that you have to achieve 25% above the state standard for your energy and water consumption, which is extraordinary and a very brave thing to do. But, you know, there's some amazing public servants in there that have just been chipping away for years. They're doing extraordinary work, and it's coming out with results like that. And we're really excited about it. They're also looking at heat island effects, how to change the way buildings are built. We've got this obsession with glass, and now we're hearing that even low E glass, which is that sort of glass that reflects heat out and refuses to let it come into the building, sounds great for the occupants, but what it's doing is heating up the urban environment. I mean, who could see that one coming? So now they're trying to figure out how to change that. It's really interesting work, and it's quite revolutionary, and it's like looking at our whole built environment from scratch and starting again. They're the main trends anyway.
That's great, and a perfect segue through business, whether it's innovation, state or local governments, whether it's in the East, whether it's environment, documented and championed this year. And so we're starting this off, we're kicking this off with a summit in Parliament House on the 11th of February. Yes, it's very soon, That comes about because we've only recently received some important funding support for this, and we need to get cracking on doing it. But we already have 22 speakers, or commentators as we're calling them, going to be talking, including Dr. John Hewson, Professor Frank Jotzo, the CEO of Edelman, who will be sharing with us a teaser of the Australian insights into the Edelman Trust Barometer. So Davos only had the global. This will have an insight into what's happening in Australia. Jonathan Judson from the Australian Energy Productivity Council, Brooke Donnelly from the APCO, and Scarbeck from ClimateWorks. And we're really delighted that the Honourable Member for Warringah, Zali Steggall, is going to join us during morning tea and give us a sense of what is the anticipated private members bill that she would be putting forward to Parliament in March, which I think is the first signal, as particularly Murray indicated, that there is the possibility, a chink, perhaps even a crack in the door of some sort of consensus or bipartisan or even multi-partisan approach to our climate policy in Australia. So we want you to come, and if you're interested in coming, once I've sent out through the email, you will see a link to the registration. If you are a member of BCSD, you will receive a separate email this morning which will give you immediate access to a free ticket to the event. And if you're not, there are still discounted tickets to be had through Eventbrite. The registration went live this morning. And if you are a friend of BCSD, we're also happy to organise for you to receive a complimentary ticket. So we want you to be there. We want you to be part of the audience because the audience is actually going to be a critical part of the development of the response to the National Determined Contribution, because during the course of the day, we're going to be using engagement interactive software tools to get your feedback during the sessions around the issues of ambition, action and transition. So we strongly encourage you to attend, and as I say, you will receive the link to the registration immediately following this webinar. But for now, it really is up to me to thank very much Rachael in absentia, Murray and Tina for their contribution this morning. That was fantastic. Don't forget to register to their online media sites. I will send out the links to each of them. They are invaluable resource for any professional in business around the issues, attitudes, trends, challenges, policies, regulation, and just thought that's going on in Australia in relation to the sustainability agenda for business, which is actually quite active. But for now, conscious of time, thank you very much to everybody for dialing in this morning. And but for the rest of the day, thank you very much for joining. And this is Andrew Petersen signing off from this morning's webinar, and trust that you have a safe journey onwards for the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew. Bye.